The file had been corrupted so cleanly, so surgically, that if Elias Varga hadn't spent 14 years learning to read the difference between an accident and an apology, he might have believed it was simply broken. Files broke all the time inside the Interspecies Resettlement Authority. The database infrastructure ran on a patchwork of 3 different operating systems, 2 of which had been discontinued, and 1 of which had never technically been approved for government use in the first place, a fact that the authority's IT division handled by not discussing it. Things broke, records fragmented, entire case histories occasionally vanished into the system the way a sock vanishes in a laundry cycle, inexplicably, completely, and with a philosophical indifference to how much you needed them. But this was not that. This was something else, and Elias knew it the way you know when a window has been broken from the inside. He was sitting at his desk on the 14th floor of the authority's regional hub, a building whose architects had apparently been briefed to create something that communicated institutional permanence while somehow still feeling like it could be disassembled over a long weekend. The recycled air carried its usual suggestion of coffee, bureaucratic anxiety, and whatever Dov was eating at the adjacent desk. Dov was always eating something that produced a smell disproportionate to its size. New case. Dov said, not looking up from his own screen, which was displaying what appeared to be a very complicated transit manifest. Missing child, Elias said. Vithari, 8 years old. Dov reached into his desk drawer and produced a nutrition bar of the kind that claimed on its packaging to contain the complete dietary requirements of an active adult, a claim Elias found ambitious. Those are the hard ones. They're all the hard ones. Yes, but some of them are hard in interesting ways, and some of them are hard in ways that make you question your life choices. Elias looked at the file on his screen. The girl's name was S. Civil. Her intake photograph showed a child with the wide, tricolored irises characteristic of Vithari youth, large enough that the image seemed to be mostly eyes, with bioluminescent tracery along her hairline that in the photograph appeared a deep, uncertain amber. She had arrived at the Meridian 7 transit hub on a vessel carrying 412 Vithari refugees from the collapse of the Outer Reach settlements, one of 18 such vessels that had appeared in human-administered space over the preceding 3 years, with the quiet desperation of people who had run out of other directions. She had been placed in protective custody following an incident at the hub, the nature of which was listed in her file as "See attached supplementary report." The supplementary report was not attached. The field where it should have been was occupied instead by an error code that Elias had never seen before, which was notable because he had seen most of them. He submitted his first database query at 14 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. The result came back in seconds, no records matching the provided parameters. He checked the parameters. They were correct. He resubmitted. No records. He tried the Colonial Welfare Board's external interface, which was a system so old it still displayed in a font that had been discontinued before Elias was born, and communicated its results with the unhurried confidence of infrastructure that predated urgency as a concept. No records. He tried the Meridian Transit Refugee Register, the Unified Species Census, and out of a species of desperate thoroughness, the Meridian 7 hub's own internal log, which technically wasn't supposed to be accessible from his terminal but was, because the IT division had opinions about security that were best described as theoretical. Nothing, absolutely nothing. A child who had been processed through 4 separate intake systems, assigned a case number, photographed, medically assessed, and placed in a specific supervised residential unit, had apparently ceased to exist in every database simultaneously, with a completeness that would have required either an extraordinary coincidence of simultaneous data failures across unconnected systems, or something significantly less innocent. Elias leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, where a water stain had been developing for the 3 years he'd worked in this building into a shape that he thought looked like a comet, and Dov maintained looked like a coffee cup, and their colleague Sergeant Administrator Hughes, who had no poetry in her at all, insisted looked like a structural problem. "This one," he said to no one in particular, "is going to be the interesting kind." From across the divider, Dav's hand appeared holding the other half of the nutrition bar. Elias took it without looking. It tasted of something the packaging called forest berry, which bore the same relationship to actual forest berries that a photograph of a window bears to the view through one. Outside the building, 14 floors down, the city went about its layered, complicated life. Human and Vithari and Kethari, and 2 other species whose transit visas were still being processed through a committee that had been deliberating for 11 months, and somewhere within it, or somewhere beyond it, a small girl with amber light along her hairline was either lost or hidden, and Elias was not yet sure which, but he was beginning to suspect that the difference mattered more than anything else the file was currently telling him. He opened a new query window and started again. The Colonial Welfare Board's regional office existed in a state of aggressive functionality that Elias found quietly oppressive. Everything in it worked. The chairs were the correct height. The ambient lighting had been calibrated to a frequency that studies apparently showed promoted cooperative engagement, which meant it was slightly too warm and made everyone look like they were recovering from something mild. The woman behind the reception desk had the posture of someone who had been told that posture communicated trustworthiness and had taken this information very seriously indeed. He had an appointment with Coordinator Peltz at 10. It was now 10:23, which told him something about how Coordinator Peltz felt about the appointment, and at 10:31 he was shown into an office that was so precisely organized it appeared to have been assembled rather than inhabited. Coordinator Peltz had very controlled hair and the particular warmth of someone trained to produce the impression of helpfulness, the way certain plants produce the impression of flowers, structurally convincing, nutritionally absent. "We have no record of a Vithari child by that name in any of our active or archived databases," she told him, with a smile that had been placed on her face with considerable care. "I'm aware," Elias said. "I'm trying to understand how that happened. Data migration between the old and new intake systems has created some gaps. This isn't a gap. I've checked 6 systems. The absence is consistent across all of them, which statistically requires either a catastrophic and simultaneous failure of unconnected infrastructure or something a great deal more deliberate." But Coordinator Peltz's smile did not move. He suspected it was load-bearing. "I can submit a data integrity request on your behalf." "How long does that take?" "Typically 4 to 6 weeks. She's been missing for 7 months. But I understand your concern." But he was fairly certain she didn't, but he wrote down the name of the official who had overseen the Meridian 7 intake process 7 months ago, a man named Jorev Soto, whose name Elias recognized because they had worked adjacent cases 2 years prior, and Soto had been the kind of correspondent who replied to messages within the hour, any hour, with the cheerful compulsiveness of someone who had confused availability with virtue. Coordinator Peltz told him Soto was currently on administrative leave for reasons she was not at liberty to discuss. She gave him 3 other names. He thanked her. She thanked him. They parted with the mutual courtesy of 2 people who had exchanged nothing of value and both knew it. He contacted all 3 names within the week. The first had been transferred to a monitoring station on the outer edge of the Peridian asteroid belt, a posting so remote that, when Elias looked it up, he discovered it received supply ships twice yearly and had a crew of 4, one of whom was apparently a certified botanist, though what a botanist did on a rock with no atmosphere was a question the transfer documentation did not address. The second official he reached by call, a thin-faced man named Chard, who claimed, with the steady eyes of someone who had rehearsed the claim until it felt like memory, that he had no recollection of the Meridian 7 Vithari intake at all. Elias asked if perhaps he recalled any child from that period. Chard said his caseload had been very full. Elias thanked him and noted in his file that Chard had blinked 41 times during their 8-minute conversation, which was high, and that he had glanced left 17 of those times, which was a thing Elias noticed even though he did not entirely trust himself to know what it meant. Soto did not respond to any of his 6 messages. This was the detail that sat with Elias most uncomfortably, because silence from Soto was like silence from a fire alarm, technically possible, but deeply wrong in a way that made you want to check the batteries. He went back to Meridian 7 on a Thursday. The transitional zone looked, as it always did, like a place that had been described to an architect in a language neither of them spoke fluently. The structures were low and modular and various, assembled with the particular ingenuity of communities that had been given insufficient materials, and the implicit expectation that this should be enough. A Cathari elder was arguing with a vending machine outside one of the communal halls, in the slow, principled way of someone who had decided that the machine had behaved disrespectfully and intended to make this known. The machine, which dispensed nutrition packets, and had been installed by the authority as evidence of commitment to resident welfare, blinked its interface panel in what Elias had come to read as machine embarrassment. Vale Soren's office was a converted shipping container on the east side of the block, distinguished from the other converted shipping containers by the fact that it had curtains. Real curtains, fabric ones, in a color that was probably called something specific in a language Elias didn't speak. He knocked. She told him to come in without asking who he was, which either meant she was expecting him or had decided some time ago that doors were largely a formality. She was older than he had expected, not in years necessarily, but in the way that some people are old in experience, worn smooth, by having handled too many difficult things with insufficient help. The bioluminescent tracery along her collarbone held the settled, steady glow of someone who no longer surprised easily. She looked at him for a long moment before she said anything at all. "You're the one looking for S. Civil." "For 8 months," Elias said. "Yes," Vale Soren said, in the tone of someone who already knew this and found it instructive. The others who came, and others did come, with their credentials and their careful voices, none of them said her name correctly. Elias was quiet. He understood this was not an observation. It was the beginning of a direction, offered to him without ceremony, in the way that certain people offer the thing you need most by pretending it is merely a fact. He wrote it down on the way back. Not what she'd said, what it meant. Outside the transit window, the city moved past in its complicated layers, and somewhere inside it, S. Civil was still waiting for something none of the official searches had thought to try. Professor Alara Mays had spent 12 years living among the Vithari, and her documents showed it in the way that only true immersion shows. Not in the volume of information, but in the quality of attention, the way each paragraph leaned slightly forward, as if the writer was still listening for something just beyond the edge of what she had already written down. Elias had downloaded it in the first week of the case, and had returned to it in the scattered intervals between database queries and dead-end correspondence, and one particularly dispiriting meeting with a colonial welfare subcommittee that had lasted 2 hours and produced, in total, a suggestion that he file a follow-up request. He was reading it again on a Tuesday evening when he reached page 40 and found the footnote. It was not a dramatic footnote. It did not announce itself. It sat at the bottom of a page about Vithari naming conventions with the quiet patience of something that has been waiting a long time to be read by the right person. Professor Mays explained, in the precise and affectionate prose of someone who had chosen her life's work correctly and knew it, that the Vithari name carried tonal registers the way a musical instrument carried octaves. The same name, the same syllables, shaped differently by the relationship between speaker and recipient. There was the formal register, which was phonetically simple, and was what every cross-species communication course taught because it was accessible and adequate and produced results in the way that a map of a city produces results. You got somewhere, just not necessarily where you meant to go. There was the social register, warmer, used between people who had shared meals or difficulty. And then there was the familial register, which required a tonal precision that Mays described, in a sentence Elias read 3 times, as the phonetic shape of trust. It was used by family, by people who had earned the right to say your name as if they already knew the answer to it. He sat with the footnote for a long time. Outside his window, the city's upper transit lanes moved with the specific patience of infrastructure that had been designed for a population of 3 million and was now serving 6, the transit pods moving in their overhead channels like slow thoughts through an overworked mind. He did not notice them. He was doing the arithmetic of 8 months, of 17 database queries, of Coordinator Peltz's load-bearing smile and Soto's thunderous silence, and Vale Sauron saying none of them said her name correctly in the tone of someone handing him a key and waiting to see if he recognized what it opened. He opened his language files at 10:30 that night. He had basic Vithari, the formal register, the tourist-level competency that the authority required for specialists assigned to non-human cases, and that was sufficient for intake interviews and formal proceedings, and approximately nothing else. He found the tonal notation for the familial register in the appendix of Mays's document. He read it. He attempted it. He sounded, on his first try, like someone had asked a language to do something it found offensive. He practiced for 11 days. He practiced in the mornings while his coffee cooled to a temperature he would forget to drink it at. He practiced on the transit to the authority offices, quietly enough that the other passengers registered only a man moving his lips, which in the context of a morning commute was not notable. On the 4th day, Dov heard him through the partition between their desks and asked, with genuine professional concern, whether Elias had developed a neurological symptom he wanted to discuss. Elias explained what he was doing. Dov was quiet for a moment, and then said that this was either very clever or very sad and possibly both, and offered him a segment of something he was eating that he claimed was a Cathari-influenced protein cake. It tasted like a sincere effort that had not quite succeeded, which Elias supposed was true of most things worth attempting. By the 9th day, the tonal shape was coming. Human vocal architecture resisted it the way a borrowed instrument resists a new player, not refusing exactly, but requiring a particular quality of stubbornness to produce the sound it was built for. He listened to recordings from Mays's archive, to Vithari speakers using the familial register with their own children, and he heard in those recordings something that transcribed poorly into linguistic notation, but translated clearly into feeling. A voice saying, "I know the weight of your name, and I am not afraid to carry it." On the 12th day, he did not go to the authority offices. He did not file a query or contact an official or attend a meeting in a room with calibrated lighting. He packed a bag with his notes, a transit pass, and the food Vale Sauron had pressed into his hands the previous afternoon when he'd stopped to tell her what he was going to try. She'd produced it from somewhere inside the converted shipping container without comment, with the manner of a woman who had been quietly preparing for this visit since approximately the 2nd time he'd come to ask questions, and the food was Vithari, not the synthetic approximation the authorities' nutrition dispensers produced, but actual food. And he didn't ask how she'd obtained it, because some questions are less important than the answer they'd interrupt. The Meridian 7 transitional zone received him with its usual indifference. A group of Vithari children were playing something near the communal hall involving a piece of cord and a set of rules that appeared to change every few minutes by mutual negotiation. An authority maintenance drone was hovering near the water reclamation unit making a sound that suggested something was wrong with either its propulsion or its opinion of the situation. The abandoned distribution center stood where it had always stood, its ventilation system threading through the adjacent buildings like a circulatory system that had outlasted the body it belonged to. Elias found the loading bay. He stood in it. He did not produce his documentation or his official equipment. He thought about what Mays had written, that the familial register meant, in the phonological sense, something close to, "I see you as someone worth being seen by." He said S. Civil's name, once, quietly, in the register that belonged to family, and then he waited in the specific silence of a man who has spent 8 months looking and has finally, possibly, stopped searching and started arriving. The ventilation panel moved with the careful, practiced silence of something that had been opened many times by someone who had learned that noise was a liability. It was a small sound, the soft displacement of metal against metal, the specific quiet of a child who had turned survival into a discipline. And then S. Civil was there, standing at the edge of the access point, looking at him with the wide tricolored irises that the photograph in her file had not fully prepared him for. Because photographs do not carry the particular quality of attention that a child develops after months of trusting no one. The bioluminescent tracery along her temples was flickering in a rapid, uncertain amber that Elias recognized from Mays's document as the physiological pattern of an alert state beginning, very cautiously, to consider resolution. She was smaller than he had expected. He had known, intellectually, that months of inadequate food and the specific compression of long hiding would do that. Knowing it and seeing it were different calibrations of the same difficult fact. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. He did not move. He had learned in 14 years of this work that the most important thing you could do in the first moment of finding a frightened child was to make the space around them larger rather than smaller, to take up less room than the situation seemed to require. He stood with his hands visible and his bag on the floor and let her read whatever she needed to read in his face. She said something in Vithari. He caught perhaps 2/3 of it. His formal register was solid. His familial register was 11 days old and assembled from a linguistic appendix and a great deal of stubborn repetition. But he understood enough. She was asking how he knew, how he had said it like that. He told her in his careful and imperfect Vithari that he had read about her people, that he had wanted to say her name correctly. He used the social register for this, which felt right, not the formality of a stranger, not yet the intimacy he hadn't earned, but something in between, the register of someone who was trying. She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to have its own weather. Then she climbed out of the ventilation access point with the matter-of-fact ease of someone for whom this particular action had become as ordinary as using a door, and she sat down cross-legged on the floor of the loading bay, in the direct and unceremonious manner of a child who has made a decision and sees no further value in the formality of making it gradually. Elias sat down across from her. The concrete was cold, and his knees registered this opinion with some feeling, which he ignored. He reached into his bag and produced the food Veilsoran had given him, set it between them without comment, and watched S. Civil look at it with the complicated expression of someone who has had to think about food so constantly, and so anxiously, that encountering it unexpectedly required a moment of emotional processing before it could become simply eating. She ate. He sat with her while she did. He told her, in the mixture of careful Vithari and slow standard that was the best he could offer, that the official search perimeter had been operating 3 blocks from where she was hiding for the past 4 months. She looked at him over her food, with an expression that he could only read as the Vithari equivalent of course it was. He told her that the Colonial Welfare Board had submitted a data integrity request on her behalf in the 8th week of the search, the results of which were expected in 2 to 4 more weeks, which was the institutional equivalent of sending a letter to a fire. The tracery along her hairline flickered briefly in a pattern that Mays's document associated with something between disbelief and reluctant recognition, which he thought was exactly the correct response. He told her about Dov. He was not entirely sure why, except that Dov seemed like a safe subject and safe subjects had value. He told her about the cactus, which Dov had named something that translated from the Cathari-influenced slang of the authority offices as roughly persistent, and which had survived 3 years of a desk environment that was hostile to most organic life. S. Civil stopped eating for a moment and looked at him with an expression that required no translation whatsoever. He told her that he agreed it was unreasonable to name a cactus, and yet there it was. The light along her temples shifted slowly, the way weather shifts rather than the way moods shift, into something steadier and warmer. He looked it up later, in Maze's document, sitting in the transit pod on the way back with S. Civil asleep against his shoulder, with the absolute commitment of a child who has finally decided that sleeping is safe. The steady warm light was what Maze called Sathvale, which translated imperfectly as the feeling of being correctly seen, and which the Vithari considered one of the more significant things one person could offer another. In the weeks that followed, the things that had been buried began, slowly and with institutional reluctance, to surface. The official on administrative leave was found to have received payments from a private security contractor with interests in Meridian 7's redevelopment zone, the kind of interests that preferred certain witnesses to certain things to remain unfindable. SOD eventually responded to messages from a legal representative, which was its own kind of answer. The monitoring station on the edge of the Peridian asteroid belt received an unexpected third supply run that year, carrying with it a subpoena for the botanist's predecessor, whose reassignment paperwork contained irregularities that the authority's internal review office described, in the measured language of people who knew exactly what they were looking at, as irregular in ways consistent with deliberate obstruction. The Cathari elder who had been arguing with the vending machine outside the Meridian 7 communal hall, Elias learned later, had eventually won. The machine had been replaced. Vale Soren received his report with the expression of someone who had expected it to arrive, and was satisfied primarily by the fact that it had. She read it in full, in the curtained shipping container that was the closest thing to an embassy the Vithari of Meridian 7 had. And when she finished, she set it on the table and said that he had written it like a person rather than an institution, which she delivered as a compliment and he received as one. He filed the report on a Friday. He sat at his desk afterward in the recycled air of the 14th floor and looked at the water stain on the ceiling, which had not changed, which was still a comet or a coffee cup, depending on your orientation to mystery and your tolerance for the ceiling meaning something. Dov brought him a piece of the protein cake that tasted like a sincere effort, and Elias ate it and found that today, for reasons he did not fully interrogate, the effort was enough. He had entered the case believing he was looking for a child. He had spent 8 months looking in every direction that a system designed for finding problems had pointed him, and found nothing, because S. Civil was not a problem. She was a person, with a name that had a correct way of being said, and she had been waiting with the extraordinary patience of a child who has learned to outlast institutions, for someone to say it correctly. The search that had gone nowhere for so long ended in seconds, and what ended it was not a better database or a new procedural approach or a subcommittee recommendation. It was the simple act of learning someone's name well enough to mean it. He thought about this on the transit home, watching the city move past in its layers and its complications, and its ongoing negotiation between species and systems and the perpetual human tendency to process people as categories until something forces you to stop. He thought about the 14 years before this case, and the case that had started all of them, the child he hadn't reached in time, because he had trusted the system's map more than his own instinct that the map was wrong. He thought about the footnote on page 40 of a document that most people in his position had never read past the executive summary. He did not think he had become a different person. He thought he had become a more accurate version of the same one, which is, perhaps, the only kind of change that actually holds.